Hello to everyone in our Word on Fire Institute family. My name is Dr. Matthew Petrusik. I'm the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and welcome to another Evangelization and Culture Live, our regular live seminars on pressing topics at the intersection of faith and culture. And friends, we are delighted to have in studio with us today, again live, the great Monsignor Shea, who will be giving a special one-day seminar, so today only, on Thirsting for God, how to address young adults' crisis of meaning. Now, before we get him up before the podium, please, as I always ask you to do, open up that chat box and introduce where you are connecting from. One of the great gifts of technology, there are some downsides to it. One of the great gifts is that we can't be together in real space, but we are together in real time. And as you introduce yourself, look at all of the great diversity, geographic diversity within the family of God. So again, today's seminar is Thirsting for God, how to address young adults' crisis of meaning. Monsignor Shea will be giving a lecture, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So please begin getting them into the chat right now. Without any further ado, we welcome Monsignor Shea to the podium. Class is in session.
Matt, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Everybody, why don't we start with a prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O most high and glorious God, cast your light into the darkness of our hearts. Give us right faith, firm hope, and perfect charity, with wisdom and perception, that we might know and do your most holy will. May your light within us burn, shining forth in perfect charity. Amen. Amen. Mary, Mother of the Church, pray for us. Well, everybody, I've been asked to speak today about the crisis of meaning among young adults. And as I think about my own capacity to speak into such a question, I hope you'll forgive me if I begin our time together with a little bit of my own history. Normally, I wouldn't do that, but I think it's particularly germane to this topic. I've spent all my priesthood working with young adults in our culture. I was ordained a priest in 2002, and I was 7 years a high school teacher and chaplain. And then I've been at the University of Mary for almost 17 years now. And so I've been working with young people all through my priesthood, pouring my life out in service to them, loving them as best as I can, and receiving from them the insights and difficulties and struggles of their life and accompanying them in that. It's been a great honor for me. But it didn't begin very well. And here's what I mean by that. I was ordained, as I mentioned just a moment ago, in the year 2002. Catholics who have been around in the United States for just a little while remember that that was the year that Father Richard John Newhouse, the founder of First Things, called our Long Lent. It was the year when the clergy sex abuse scandal erupted in a very significant way in this country, blazing from Boston, eventually all the way to Dallas, where the bishops had an emergency meeting. At that time, I was a student at the North American College in Rome, and so I wasn't here in the United States. And I was hearing, as were all of my classmates, things kind of secondhand. We had the internet, of course, but the communication back and forth wasn't as immediate. There was no social media to speak of. And we wondered what was happening. One morning, I got up to go to class. I was a student at the John Paul II Institute at the Lateran University, and I was walking to class. I would walk every morning through the old city of Rome, down the spine of the Circus Maximus, and over to the Lateran University. And there were all of the cardinals in the United States on the front steps of the North American College. They had been summoned to Rome by Pope St. John Paul II, who wanted an account of what was happening in the United States. And so I didn't know what was happening entirely. And it was just a lot of really difficult and sordid and solemn news. Well, in the midst of this, after the meeting in Denver, my bishop called me and he said, I know that you're supposed to finish your higher studies because I was studying for the licentiate in sacred theology at the JP2 Institute. But he said, I have to call you home. We made a decision in Denver about priests, and there are a couple of priests who have long ago historical accusations against them, and they need to go, and that's going to create a shuffle in the Diocese of Bismarck, and I need you home. I remember thinking at that point, that's the end of higher education for me. I remember thinking, that's the end of higher education for me. I've been in school a long time, and it's time to go to work. And so the bishop then proceeded to tell me that I would be assigned as chaplain and as a teacher at our largest Catholic high school, St. Mary's Central High School in Bismarck. Well, this was not welcome news for me for several different reasons. When I was in high school, I don't remember much liking it, and so I thought, now they're sending me back. But the worst thing was this: I didn't know what they would think about a priest. I didn't know what was happening, remember, in the headlines back home. And I thought, are they going to think I'm some kind of pervert? What's going to happen when I walk into that classroom? And I was really frightened by that and concerned about it. But what happened is that when I entered into that classroom, all of that melted away. It was one of the singular, most powerful moments of grace in my whole life. That there, so new a priest, I had just been ordained the month before, so new a priest, I was given a sense of deep love for the young people who were in front of me. And I just taught my heart out. I realized in that moment that I had been given something tremendous, that the church and the whole tradition, the whole Christian and Catholic tradition of intellectual life and vitality had poured tremendous energy into my mind and into my heart, and that this was my chance to give back. And I was deeply consoled by that. And so all of that, all of the anxiety, all of the fear melted away in an instant when I picked up that piece of chalk and when I began to teach. I was teaching juniors in high school at the time. But very soon, I noticed something which was unfamiliar for me. This was very helpful as well. I noticed this. You know, I had grown up in rural North Dakota, in probably one of the most rural places that you can find, in the last gasp of what could be called Christendom, old Christendom. Indeed, my life as a boy could be described in the manner of bishops of the early to mid 20th century, people like Edwin Vincent O'Hara and Aloysius Minch, the founders of the Catholic rural life movement. And so, I was growing up on a farm, the oldest of 8 children. My parents were very serious Christians, as were most of the people in town. And there was a sense of what life was all about. There was a closeness to the land and a dependence upon God. All of those things were present. It wasn't a perfect childhood, but it was blessed in many ways. Hard work, closeness to the land, and the whole of our lives, the rhythm of life, rotated around the central sun, which was the Catholic faith and her prayer and her liturgical practices, rogation days and Easter and Christmas and all these things. I've told the story before how I remember when I was a boy, my dad would tell me that we should give more feed to the cattle on Easter and Christmas. He said, even our cattle should know that we're Christians. And that was the kind of ethos that I had arisen out of. That was a great impediment to me, actually, when I went off to the Catholic University of America for philosophy studies and then continued in my theology studies in Rome. And the reason it was an impediment is that very often the problems that were being addressed in my classes and that I was being prepared for in seminary formation, a lot of those problems didn't occur to me as immediately germane or urgent. And so I think I underestimated the importance of understanding what was really happening in modernity and in post-modernity, and how the church needed to address that, because I was approaching my studies from the vantage of what I myself had been given. But when I started teaching high school, when I returned to North Dakota after all of my studies, both in Washington, D.C. and in Rome, and when I got with these young people in the trenches of their hearts, when I embarked upon the I suppose the greatest apostolic honor of my life, which is the work of evangelization among young people, as this happened for me, I noticed something in them which caused everything to fall into place, even as it profoundly disturbed me. And that was this, that, to borrow a phrase from the Catholic American novelist Walker Percy, they were lost in the cosmos. There was something unsettled in my students. They had grown up in Catholic families, sometimes maybe only 2 or 3 generations off the farm where I had come from. They had a sense, because they had gone to Catholic school all their lives, most of them, for Catholic culture and Catholic practice and even Catholic teaching, but it somehow wasn't landing for them. And I was able to experience in my students, whom I was given to serve and to love, the profound unsettledness of modern and postmodern life, which I've come to see now much more clearly as I've come deeper into adulthood and in service to the church. And so my students were afflicted by what so many people all around us were afflicted by, the imminence of our surrounding reality, the materialism all around us, the way that the whole world has been flattened out. Because we only believe really in what meets the eye, because of the materialism, the immanentism that we struggle with and that we've been fed, that our culture has so incubated over the course of about the last 300 years. Because of that, our life is without inherent meaning. And my students, young people, feel this with a particular poignancy. So we didn't come from anywhere, and we're not going anywhere. My life doesn't speak to me. There's no inherent meaning within it that I need to discover. No, indeed, I need to make it up myself. I need to find a way to impart meaning to my own life. This is meant to be liberating, because my life is a great canvas upon which I can make my mark. Life is subject to my own creativity, and it's up to me to determine what the meaning and purpose of my life is, and to find fulfillment in that. And my students were feeling that. And there was a kind of, undergirding this, there was a kind of unrelenting affirmation. You can be whoever you want to be. The world is your oyster. Go at it. Be something. And this was meant, of course, it's good intentioned. It's meant, the words were meant to be words of affirmation and encouragement. But I found that they landed for my students as a kind of crippling weight on their shoulders, because they were young, standing on the doorstep of their lives. And they wanted to know what to do with their life, how to find meaning and purpose, happiness, joy. But they weren't being told that by the culture, at least. We were trying to tell them in their Catholic education, but they weren't being told that by the ambient culture. And in fact, what they were being told was much the opposite. And so what was meant to liberate actually enslaved. What was meant to empower actually caused them to come up short, because they didn't know what they wanted to do. Or if they did know what they wanted to do, they didn't think that that could fill the whole of their lives, that it was the full measure of their potency or their potential as a human being. And so as a result, they were bumping up against what Kierkegaard, remember, called unrealized unrealized despair, that life can go on autopilot. Sister Wendy Beckett, do you remember her from the BBC's Story of Art? She used to talk about the tragedy of becoming a zombie, that there's this danger that we can go on to autopilot with our lives, and just life becomes one thing after another, after another, after another. And that sometimes we find a little bit of release or relief by bursts of amusement or entertainment or numbing ourselves here and there. We live for the weekend. We live for the next holiday or vacation. But there just wasn't sufficient, and there isn't sufficient ballast in that. There's not enough metaphysical ballast in order for life to make meaning or to make sense to any of us. And so that, I think, is the sort of budding tragedy. Now remember, this was way back in 2002, 2003, 2004. This was quite a long time ago. This was before the mental health crisis that Jonathan Haidt and others have identified, the anxious generation, as a result of addiction to social media and other societal factors. But I just sensed it in my students, and I didn't remember it in the way that I had been raised. And so all of a sudden, my philosophical and theological studies came into sharp focus, because I realized that they had, and I hate to use this other philosophical phrase, they had a kind of, is this from James? They had a kind of cash value, that there was something that I could do with what I had learned, and that this might be of value to the young men and women who are under my charge. And so I attempted my best to try and wake them up from this. Around the same time, Bishop Robert Barron, then Father Robert Barron, released a book, and I'd never heard of him before, and it was called The Strangest Way. Some of you must remember that book. Came out around the time of my ordination, and here's The Strangest Way. And he builds this book around various principles, things that we have to get straight in order to understand the Christian thing. And one of them was get over yourself, or he put it like this, that your life is not about you. Your life is not about you. And this became, and remains to this day, I'm deeply grateful to Bishop Barron for this. This remains to this day a mantra for me that I've said to countless numbers of young people. Every student who's come through the University of Mary in the years under my leadership has heard me say this multiple times. Your life is not about you. It's your life, yes it is, but it's not about you. You've been given gifts and talents, but there are people out in the world who need your gifts and talents more than you need them. And unless you find a way to give yourself away in love, unless you find a way to invest all that you've been given in other people, in a great adventure which you don't make up for yourself, but which you can discover, the mystery of your calling, the mystery of the reason that you were brought into existence in the first place, you'll never be happy. You'll never find happiness, joy, meaning, or purpose so long as you make your life just about you. This I found when I would say to young people, and when I say to them today, get over yourself. Your life is not about you. You would think that they would feel kind of pushed down or oppressed or repressed by this kind of thing, but it's not true. They find terrific freedom in that, because they realize that they weren't made for nothing, that they're not some kind of accident. This is Pope Benedict XVI's reminder to young people, that they're not an accident, that they were brought into purpose as the result of a decision of love, and that God has, this is Cardinal Newman, God has some great purpose for them, which he hasn't entrusted to anyone else, that they're as important in their place as an archangel is in his. And when young people realize this, that life does speak to them, that they did come from somewhere and that they are going somewhere, when this realization washes over their life, they realize, oh, I can respond to life then, which means I can be responsible. I can respond to my life. And this is what our young people are very deeply longing for. Now, there's another thing, and here I'm going to commit what I suppose is the great mortal sin here, at Word on Fire, this apostolate, which is dedicated first and foremost to the work of evangelization. But stick with me. What I say, I think, will appear repulsive at the beginning, but then we'll recover, I think. So rather than speaking first about the evangelization of our young people, could we talk a little bit about the disangelization of young people, the work of disangelization? So evangelization, of course, as you know, evangelion, this is the good news, the good announcement. Disangelization is the bad announcement. And here's the point. If you look back at the beginning of the modern era, if you look back at how we got where we are now, oftentimes people think about modernity as being born in the rejection of God. That at the very beginning of the modern era, there were a group of people who were just sick and tired of religion and said, we've got to get rid of it and we've got to get rid of God. I don't think that that's quite accurate in that way. Some of the pioneers of modernity, some of those sort of prominent Enlightenment philosophers found God quite useful for various reasons in their thinking. But there was an idea which almost universally they did not find useful at all, and which they were really resistant to and hated actually with all their might. And this was the idea of original sin, the Christian teaching of the fall. I mean, this still perdures to our day. The other day, what Christopher Hitchens Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins was on Cosmic Skeptic podcast saying that original sin is the most evil idea in the New Testament. This idea that there was, as Newman said, an aboriginal catastrophe, that there was some grave rebellion by which human beings separated themselves from their creator and became enslaved to dark powers which were beyond their strength. That there is within us a downward lurch toward that which we know is evil, that, as St. Paul says, we can't do the good that we want to do, and we can't resist the evil which we know that we shouldn't do, and that there's a wretchedness in us, that there is a wound, a deep wound, deep within each human person, and that we're not what we're supposed to be. This teaching, this idea of original sin, was detestable at the beginning of the modern era, and was largely and widely rejected. This is a perplexity. G.K. Chesterton said that original sin is the only empirically provable part of our faith, and so that it would be rejected at the beginning of what we call, or what we consider to be, the great age of science, the age of empiricism, that we would reject the one thing which is provable, is, in a certain sense, a great paradox. But one way or the other, that's what happened. And that does lead first to a practical atheism, and then to an outright atheism, to a rejection of God. Because, if we're not fallen, if there's nothing for us to be rescued from, if we don't have this downward lynch or this wound deep inside of us, we might need God to wind us up and get us going. But we certainly can handle everything from there. And then all of life becomes the crafting of certain utopian dreams or utopias. In other words, if we have the right technology or the right education or social revolution, if we have the right social structures, if we arrange or rearrange life in just the perfect way, we can arrive at a perfect arrangement. Because there's no, again, here's Chesterton. Remember, he said in answer to that essay contest by the London Times, "What's wrong with the world? Dear sirs," he said, "I am." Sincerely, GKC. I am what's wrong with the world. And if we're not able to answer that, then all of a sudden, we should be able to arrange things and arrive at a utopia. And we see what this has done time and time and time again, great utopian schemes have come forward in the course of human affairs. And each of them, in its own way, has metastasized into a catastrophic dystopia, the Gulag and the Holocaust, and on, that in fact we're not capable of building a utopia here. The word utopia, as you remember, comes from that 1516 text written by St. Thomas More. Utopos means no place in Greek. It was a work of socio-political satire because Thomas More was a Christian. He knew that there's no such thing in a fallen world as a perfect society. Young people, by their nature, are high-hearted and idealistic. And so they're sitting ducks for every latest utopian scheme. And yet, although in a past era that might have manifested itself as some kind of rebellion, the only thing we have to lose is our change, whether it's the French Revolution of the 1780s or the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s. That kind of rebellion you don't find as much anymore because everything has been lulled. There's been a kind of flattening out. The arrival of zombiedom is here. And young people are just feeling very sad. And they don't quite know what to do with that because they're not stupid, and neither are you and I. When we look out into the world, we see that we have everything that we could expect to want or to need. Never before have we been able to arrange our lives exactly in the way that we'd like. Never have we obliterated time and space with technology in the way that we have. Never have we been more comfortable. And yet, when we look at the landscape of the world in which we live, people aren't deliriously happy overall. Our rates of anxiety, depression are sky high. And what's the cause of this? Well, I go back to this relentless affirmation that people used to give to my students that I needed to dissuade them of by saying, get over yourself. Your life is not about you. I go back to that to that aspect. Sometimes I think, and I don't want to overstate this, but I think that the modern obsession with utopian schemes, the idea that there's nothing wrong in here, that I need to be rescued from, that I need to be healed from, that idea means that if I'm having negative emotions, or if apparently everything's fine with my life, I've been given a lot, and yet I'm still very sad, listless, aimless, I don't have purpose or meaning, and I feel sad or depressed about it, that there's something fundamentally wrong with me. And what I think we've done there, and we have to be thoughtful about this, is that we've pathologized normal emotions. I tell to our students, I say, sometimes in life, negative emotions are the most reasonable response to reality and to the truth which is right in front of you. And just because, our emotions are given to us as a great gift by God at a certain stage in human history, they kept us from being eaten by tigers. And so there are still tigers that are lurking around, lying in the bush here, and we need to be alert to them. And so I think that very often we've pathologized normal emotions in young people, and we've told them that if they're feeling sad, if their response to the world that they've inherited, the world in many ways which we've given to them, is one of sadness or of a lack of meaning or purpose, a listlessness, that there's something fundamentally wrong with them. When in fact, what's wrong with them is different from what they think, that they, like all of us, need to be healed of sin. But then what's wrong with the world as well is approached in a different way than they might expect. And so I think that we have to preach the bad news to young people. And this is where the Christian gospel comes in really a very, very potent way. Because when you first hear the gospel, it doesn't make things better. Christianity is not first and foremost a kind of therapeutic solution to life. In fact, if you're paying attention, the gospel makes things worse to begin with. The beginning of the kerygma is the catastrophic, no holds barred disaster of the fall. Our rebellion is very bad. Sin runs very deep in us. The wound of sin is something for which there is no immediate or natural cure. We're dead. We're goners. Everything is the worst. This is not unrealized despair. This is not modern life as the crossroads between life with inherent meaning and the pathway to despair. This is dark despair, 100%. That's the bad news. Our rebellion against God is not a small thing, and indeed, in order to rescue us from it, it took Jesus's death, it took his blood, it took his suffering and his resurrection, and so to help our young people to understand and to grasp that they're not crazy, that their dis-ease, human beings, this is true in every age, not just our age, we're the only creatures, the only animals, let me be specific, we're the only animals who are ill at ease with our existence. We're the only animals who have to learn what it means to be who we are, learn how to be human. And this is a great task and a difficult task. And so when our young people look around and they sense that there's something fundamentally wrong, for us to cover over it or to just try and cheer it away in them, it won't work. This, I think, is one of the reasons why we see young people suddenly and in a very encouraging way turning toward faith in a more demonstrable way. Because I think that our young people are seeing that in the Catholic faith, in Christianity, there's a way forward that otherwise they might not have been able to have access to, that the whispers of the world are not true, and that everything around them, technology and a life of comfort and ease, utopian schemes, these things don't keep their promises. And in fact, in the wake of all the broken promises, that there's another way for them to go. And the alternative, of course, is that we continue to live in what C.S. Lewis called an anesthetic fog. Who was it? T.S. Eliot, who said that humankind cannot bear very much reality. and so as a result, we're like people who live on an island together, and we're all afflicted with a terminal disease, which is eating away at us on the inside. But we're all in denial about it. And we're going along as though there's absolutely nothing wrong. This is the premise upon which the modern world is built, the rejection of original sin, the rejection of the bad news. And if a doctor arrives to an island like that with a life-saving remedy, that arrival is the best thing that could ever happen. If he has the elixir of salvation, a serum which will address the sickness, that's wonderful. But if everybody's in denial, the arrival and the announcement of that doctor will not be considered good news. And in fact, he might very well be killed. And that's the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And so I think that in my experience, young people are thirsting for God, absolutely. They, like St. Augustine, remember when he lost his young friend, he said, mihi quaestio factus sum. I became a great problem to myself. I became a great question to myself. Our young people like St. Augustine before them, are great questions to themselves, a quandary. And they're looking for someone who can give an actual account of the world in which they're living, both the world out here and the world that each of them holds inside. Our Catholic faith has that. And so to be able to capture young people's minds and imaginations, we first have to tell them the bad news. We have to, and they're ready to receive it because they've tasted it. They have, the Italians would say, an assaggio. They have a taste of it even in their young lives. They look around and they realize that all is not as it's meant to be. And when once one really hears the bad news and comes to repentance and finds oneself genuinely, not in a rote manner or in response to 12 years of Catholic school or because it's the thing to do or because I'm going through the motions, but when one really genuinely, personally comes into contact with one's own wretchedness and poverty, then one is able to receive the good news as the avalanche of relief, as the tremendous grace and blessing, as the best news that ever could be preached. And our young people want that. Not only that, and I've been thinking about this over the course of the last few weeks, not only that, but the good news doesn't just get us to heaven. Obviously it does, and nothing else matters next to that. But in addition to the gift of salvation, in addition to the tremendous relief of my life making sense in a sort of cosmic way, of no longer being lost in the cosmos, in addition to that, it allows us to navigate our lives more reasonably and more perceptively. And here, I want to turn for a moment to a book that I've just been rereading to my great delight. I think, for my money, this book is the funniest and the saddest book at the same time that I've ever read. Now, I haven't read as much as probably many of you have, and you can correct me and give me a better one, but it's Edwin O'Connor's novel, The Edge of Sadness. O'Connor was a student of the famous Frank O'Malley, who was part of the whole Dawsonian Catholic culture, literature, history movement at Notre Dame. And O'Malley was one of these legendary teachers. And Edwin O'Connor, went to Notre Dame and studied under O'Malley and then became a writer. I think he became famous finally when he wrote The Last Hurrah. But he won the Pulitzer Prize in 1962 for this book, The Edge of Sadness, which then went out of print for a long time. And Loyola Press brought it back into print for a while, and then it went out of print again. And only just very recently, Clooney Media, who are doing all kinds of very interesting stuff, have brought it back into print. And so you can get this book. It's 1962, remember, was right at the time of the council. It's like a time machine. It takes you into a world that is kind of in amber for us now, sort of the old Catholic world, just on the cusp of the culture. And I almost said protagonist, but the first sentence of the book dissuades me from that, because he says, this story is not about me. I'm in it. I'm in it to the point of almost never being out of it, but it's not about me. It's about something else. But the narrator, let's say, is a priest who's a recovering alcoholic. He had been away for 4 years of treatment after his father had died, and then he coped with it by turning to the bottle. And then he disgraced himself as a pastor and caused a lot of scandal, and then was sent off to treatment and came back and was entrusted in his diocese with kind of this old dying parish. It's a different book. Graham Greene, remember, wrote The Power and the Glory about the whiskey priest. This is a different kind of story about priests and alcohol. But in any case, and some of the dialogue is so funny to me. You might have a different sense of humor, that I fall out of my chair when I'm reading it. And some of it is so sad. Of course, the title is The Edge of Sadness, after all, that it makes you want to hang your head and cry. But at a certain point, and this is really very beautiful, and this is kind of the kind of normal capacity to relate to human life that our faith brings with it. At a certain point, this priest is asking a question which he had been afraid to ask and had never asked since he had come back from treatment. He asked an old childhood friend who was familiar with him and was around when he was at his worst. He said to her, "What did people say? How did they react when all of this happened to me and when I was sent away?" And she kind of hemmed and hawed, and finally she said, "I suppose we all felt a little bit let down." And he said, "Let down? Let down?" He said, "I knew what was behind that letdown. Much more. There was all kinds of bitter judgment. There were jokes. And there was sort of very forceful criticism. People took an account of who I was, and they eviscerated me in my absence. I'm sure of it. And in addition to that, I'm sure that outside of the gaze of responsible adults, there were any number of altar servers who, out of the gaze, again, of any supervisory eyes, would begin to mimic me, sort of walking down the street, the drunken gait of his former pastor. He said, "Yeah, I'm sure that's what was behind the words, we all felt a little bit let down." But then, this is one of, I think, the most beautiful parts of the book. He says, "But I think that in those thoughts we come to a great test, because here we can make ourselves into a victim. In our lives, we can make ourselves into a victim. Instead of a student of our life, we can become a victim of our life, because we think that that's all there is to people, and we can take the part for the whole." But he said, those same people, I'm sure of it, the same people who were harshest about me when all of it was happening, they were the same people who would have done anything to give me a little bit of help. And that altar boy who mimicked me in my drunken stupor, walking down the street, he would have been the first one to give up his morning to serve my mass and drive me halfway across the state. And then the priest goes into a Newmanian reflection, where again he quotes Cardinal Newman, this question of the great aboriginal catastrophe, the fact that there are parts in us which are at war. In other words, the wretchedness of humanity is not the only thing. It's not the whole of the story. There's great glory and beauty within us too. And that is brought, it's of course put in us by God, but brought to its fullness in the pursuit of the adventure of the Christian life. And so rather than living in some kind of a false and delusional reality, young people who are really told the Christian story, who are truly disangelized and then evangelized, who are truly formed in the whole sweeping narrative of God and his love story for our fallen race, that allows them to find the purpose and meaning of their life, to arrive at the irreplaceable gift of everlasting salvation, and also to navigate basic daily human life in a reasonable and sound way. And that, of course, is no small gift to receive, because we can spend a lot of time in delusion. Hey, I thought that toward the end of these thoughts, what would be good is to do what often is the best, to hold up the lives of the saints. But here, I want to point to someone who's not yet a canonized saint, but whose cause is open for canonization. And I talk about her mostly just because I knew her personally. And her name was Michelle Duong. Probably you've heard a little bit about her. There's this wonderful film that was released about her life called Radiating Joy. But Michelle was a contemporary of mine. She grew up, as I did, on a small farm on the prairies of North Dakota. She went off to study horticulture at North Dakota State University and then entered the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. It's an amazing story in that Focus originally rejected her application to be a missionary. And it was only on the second round of that year's selection process that she was begrudgingly given a spot on a Focus team. So this person, who now I think is a paragon and emblematic of the work of evangelization among college students, almost didn't make it on as a missionary for the Fellowship of Catholic University Students. Anyway, she went off to NDSU, she joined a Focus team, and she was dispatched to various places, to Nebraska and South Dakota. And then eventually, when Focus came to the University of Mary, this was super early in my service there, she was stationed at the University of Mary as our first team director, the team director of our first ever Focus team. It was marvelous to see her at work with young people. The way that she evangelized is she led with this kind of contagious joy. One of her spiritual fathers, a friend of mine, Father Nathan Cromley, said that spending a day with Michelle was like spending a day in the sunshine. But it wasn't just that she was cheerful. It was clear that there was a metaphysical ballast to her life, that she was a person who was deeply grounded in Jesus Christ, in God the Father, filled with the Holy Spirit, that she lived not just for God, but from God. And the college students who I was so desperate to encounter the Lord and who she was assigned to serve, those college students, upon encountering her, found she was the kind of person you looked at and you said, there's something going on in her. Whatever it is, whatever she's got, I want that. And she was able then to go deep with them into these questions of meaning and purpose and self-gift. And she, of course, echoed and acted out in the drama of her life St. Augustine's great insight, our hearts were made for you, O Lord. They're restless until they rest in you. She acted that out. When she left, finally, Focus as a missionary, she was the director of evangelization for our diocese. And she had it in her mind that she wanted to gather people, much like Mother Teresa did, around the question of the thirst of Jesus. This is one of the titles of our time together, one of the words in the title, at least, that young people have a thirst. And she knew that everyone has a thirst. And so she began to preach this question of thirst. And in fact, she founded these huge regional gatherings of people of evangelization, which she called the thirst conferences. And it was amazing. She was tremendously effective, probably the most effective evangelist that I've had the opportunity to witness close at hand in the work of the preaching and the spreading of the gospel. She was tremendous in that way. And then, now this is about 10 years ago, she was discovered to have very bad ovarian cancer. It was much more advanced when they discovered it than it probably should have been. She was given only a short period of time to live. She actually ended up living for 1 year, almost exactly 12 months after her diagnosis. We were praying like crazy. She asked us to pray to Pier Giorgio Frassati, wondering if maybe she might be the miracle for his canonization. Of course, he was canonized, wasn't he, just this last September for another miracle, though not hers. She wasn't to have her miracle in that way. And one of the hallmarks of her sickness is that she lived for months because of her treatment with terrific and horrific thirst. God gave her the gift of the thirst of Jesus as he was hanging on the cross, which of course is a thirst not just for water, but for souls. But she suffered with great thirst. But she suffered valiantly. All of us were confounded. We couldn't understand God in this. And oftentimes the ways of God are so, they're confounding. They don't seem to make sense because she was so effective as an evangelist. And so we looked around and we asked ourselves, doesn't God want his world back? Like God doesn't want to pluck in the prime of her life one of the most effective evangelists that we've ever met. And yet he did take her. You know, when the doctor came in finally to say, Michelle, there's nothing else that we can do. You're going to die, because they had been trying various aggressive kinds of treatment. When that happened, she looked at her hands lying in bed. She had grown yellow, jaundiced. All of that vivid, vibrant life seemed to have been sucked out of her. And she looked at her emaciated hands, and then she looked up at the doctor, and she said to him, Doctor, how are you doing today? You know the stories of, in mythology about how mortal beings are not able to gaze upon the divine, that we can't see the gods with naked eyes. That doctor wasn't able to respond to the question, Doctor, how are you doing today? He left the room. He just left for 10 minutes before he was able to come back in. Talk about your life is not about you. Talk about uniting yourself to the sufferings of Jesus because you found purpose and meaning in your life. Michelle radiated that. And when we look at the lives of the saints, this is something that we see again and again, especially in those who are emblematic of suffering and participation in the cross of Jesus, that the Lord makes sense of our lives in the Paschal mystery. He slakes our thirst for meaning and for purpose. And young people are crying out for that. And we have everything that we need in order to offer it to them. And so that's my message to you today, that in my long years of work with young people, they're quivering. They're waiting to hear the bad news because they know that something's wrong anyway. If we can disangelize them, if we can impress upon them the weight of the bad news, Christianity is amazing. As I said before, it's not therapeutic. It makes things worse before it makes them better, but it clarifies at least. It shows the contours of the disaster so that the solution, which is the rescue mission of Jesus Christ, can come into clearer meaning and clarity and focus. And so I hope that as we're together today, and I'm grateful to you, Matt, and to Word on Fire for inviting me. I'm grateful to everybody who's joining today. And I hope that Michelle Duong can say a prayer for all of us, that we might be great evangelists for the young people who so need our witness in this weary and wonderful world. God bless you all. Thanks so much. Matt, that's what I've got.
Well, you've given us enough to reflect on for a long time. We're so grateful for your time. And to all those watching, I just want to remind you that that we're live now, but this is also recorded. And so I know that we'll all want to be watching Monsignor's words here time and time again. So that'll be available to everyone on the Institute platform right after we finish here. So first, I just want to express the gratitude that's been pouring through in the live comments as you've been speaking. You touched many hearts today, and especially with the great testimony that you gave at the end. We all thank you. One question that's come through, and it's come through in the form of a reaction, is, of course, many of our members are parents, and some of them have adult children. And many were saying, you know what you're describing, Monsignor, that applies to my 30-year-old son or daughter, my 40-year-old son or daughter. So the question is have you seen this sort of malaise expanding in decades? And if so, how does that change how we should address any of that? We're talking about older children.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm touched, Matt, by I'm touched by the assumption behind it, behind the question, the 30-year-old, the 40-year-old. Remember, the students that I was first teaching are now 30 and 40. In other words, so I was talking precisely about the very people that many of your listeners are talking about. But there has been an expansion of the ennui and the malaise. And that has been, it's been cataloged by all kinds of people, such that I don't need to beat it like a dead horse. If you open, for instance, Jonathan Haidt's The Anxious Generation, which is a very helpful book. Now, he's not a believer,
Right.
But he has a very interesting thesis. He talks about the effect of social media, which I think has amplified some of these things. But then he goes much further back, and he talks about the sort of protectionism in parenting, which set in with stranger danger in the 1980s. He says that we're underprotecting our children in the virtual world and overprotecting them in the real world. Now, that's a very interesting thesis, and I think that it rings true for me in this respect. That oftentimes students will, even students from tremendous Catholic families, will wash up on the shores of the University of Mary, ready for their college experience. And they'll be very fearful about the world in which they live. And, the world has things in it to be afraid of. But in the end, fear is a bad counselor and a bad way to live in that respect. And if you're at a place like the University of Mary, holy cow, like we're in Bismarck, North Dakota. And so this is not sort of it's not Sodom and Gomorrah. There's plenty that's wrong where I'm from, but, there's still, Archbishop Charles Chaput once came to campus, and he called the University of Mary the Shire. He compared it to Tolkien's Shire. Now, remember, Frodo was weary of the Shire too at the end, and he said, sometimes I think what this place needs is an invasion of dragons. And so I think that's useful to remember. But the University of Mary is what we've got about 4,000 students. So we're not so great, so enormous that you can be like swallowed up. But it's also a place, where there are a lot of caring people, and you can get engaged in all kinds of small communities of faith and prayer and learning. And so I often wonder, well, what is all of that about? Well, they've been unsettled by the world which comes to them by means of social media, but also I think that sometimes we as Christians, in the way that we raise our children, we look at the contagion of the world all around us, and rather than a strategic exposure to it, which can trigger a kind of immunity, we hermetically seal them in, such that then they can't get the smallest. Well, this is not a way to build the immune system. Right, it's not a way to build the character of the young either. And so then we take that upon us. I say to our students when they come, it's the craziest thing. I took out Bishop Barron. I have to tell him this. What in my first year as president of the University of Mary, I was driving around and I would see all these huge billboards. So North Dakota has the highest number of public colleges and universities per capita in America. We have 11. Wow. We don't have very many people, but we have 11 public colleges and universities. They take my tax money and use and spend it against each other in marketing. But they had all these huge billboards that said, it's all about you, or university with YOU at the beginning, or all this stuff. And so we did a campaign at the beginning of my time. It's not about you. It's not about you. And so we did this whole thing, and students loved it. They responded to it. And it's the same thing, at freshman orientation. I get up and the parents are there getting ready to drop their students off. And I say, you're going to have your heart broken while you're here. And I'm glad for it. Not because I'm a sadist or a masochist, not because I want you to be to suffer. It's because it's going to happen anyway. And if it's going to happen, if your life's going to fall apart, it may as well fall apart in a place like this, because we can catch you as you fall, or when you fall and knock your head. We've got a place where you can recuperate. So anyway.
As a father who recently sent our firstborn to college, I know exactly what it means to be heartbroken in a good way.
Yeah,
in a good way.
Yeah, that's the best.
So we've also had many questions come along the lines of technology and screens and social media, and so I'll divide them into a couple separate questions. One is, you noted that one of the features of modernity and postmodernity is that we only believe to the extent we believe that as well, is what we can materially or empirically see with our eyes. What's your sense of how screens have exacerbated that problem, in the sense that the world is additionally now mediated to us and we're mediated to each other? And then the follow-up question is how should we be disposed as evangelists, as a church, to the use of screens as mediators with reality?
I appreciate that question, or those questions, Matt. And there are different ways that you can approach this. I'm going to go right for the jugular on this one, though, if I could.
Please.
I think that so first of all, as a disclaimer, I think social media, digital technology, these things are like any technology, any tool. You see what I mean? In other words, they're not morally inherently evil or inherently good. They're meant to be used, and a platform like Word on Fire does an amazing job of using them for great good. Bishop Aaron and his ministry is a great testament to that. So that's my disclaimer. But now I do want to say something. I think that the internet, and I've only realized this, the internet and social media are maybe the most effective counterfeit in human history to prayer. In other words, there are all kinds of things which are meant to distract us from God. And of course, it's that great tragedy that having been created on purpose with great care by a loving God, that we should live the majority of our lives without acknowledging God. That's a great tragedy. But think about this. In social media, what do? Well, we tweet or post or whatever, what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what we're desiring, our impressions of life, how we're experiencing things. That's precisely what we're meant to do in prayer. Prayer is a surge of the heart. It's relating our thoughts and feelings and desires to God. Now, when we relate our thoughts, feelings, and desires to an all-loving, all-merciful, all-wise God, or to Mary and the saints, when we do that, what do we receive? Encouragement, clarity, strength, all of the great fruit, wisdom, all of the great fruits of prayer come flooding into us. When we do the very same thing, which, by the way, we're coded to do, we're meant to, like, we're put together for prayer, we're made for it. It's not, when people say, well, how can I ever learn how to pray? Well, it's not so. You were made for it. You were made to do it. It's not a technique that you have to learn. We relate our thoughts, feelings, and desires. Now, when we do it to God and Mary and the saints, we receive consolation. When we do that same thing to other fallen human beings, we place ourselves in a very vulnerable position. And there's no doubt about it that many of the mental health challenges attendant to the use of social media have to do with the very strange activity of curating a profile of me at my very best and then seeing how people react to it. I'm going to put out what I think I should say and how I think I should look. But if I invest my whole self in that, the criticism is devastating. And so I think that here's what I think the real response is, because your viewers are wanting like tactical stuff. And well, this is the most tactical. I think we should learn how to pray, and we should invest ourselves in prayer, and we should pray twice as much as we're ever on screens. apart from like doing our work and answering emails from HR and stuff. But we should do that, because here's what we do. I do this for myself, and I have to be reminded that I'm a Catholic priest. So this morning I got up, and before I came here, I celebrated the Eucharist, and I was mostly present for it, but sometimes my mind, whatever. But I go to my chapel, I expose the Eucharist, and I look at the host, and I say, "Oh, Jesus, I make an act of faith that you are infinitely more fascinating than anything I could find on the internet."
Wow, that's good.
You are infinitely, that everything that I would need to know, I can find in you much better and much clearer than I could ever find in some kind of spasm of curiositas, where I say, "Oh, what are the economic causes of the Second Crusade?" And then I spend hours and hours on the internet, and suddenly I'm on a Wikipedia page talking about the mating habits of penguins at the South Pole. I mean, it's all we squander our lives doing this. You know what I mean? We waylaced our powers, right? That's which poet is that? Ugh. We lay waste our. No, anyway.
We certainly recognize the quote.
Yeah.
Connected to this, such a brilliant answer. Connected to this is, so there's the problems of social media, and I love the framing you just gave it. But then we kind of see social media can be an evangelical antidote as well. That's something we're trying to do at Word on Fire. But now we have a new problem with the rise of self-identified Catholics on social media.
Yes.
Who, I'm not going to name any names, but we're probably all aware of the accounts, who have very large followings, who claim to speak in the name of the church, and who are now evangelizing in a direction that's not in line with Catholic teaching. And some of this is coming from people who would call themselves conservatives. So how do we address this problem?
Yeah. Well, so you went right there, Matt, into something that I consciously left out because I didn't think I had time to attend to it.
It's on people's minds.
Part of the difficulty of our societal situation is that in the midst of all of the malaise, there's a complete rejection of authority too.
Yeah, right.
And authority is super helpful in terms of assisting us in saying, how does my life speak to me? How can I find inherent meaning in those kinds of things? And so also, and this has been a much harder thing for me to do. What I talked to you all about today is the easier part, preaching the bad news and then preaching the good news.
Yeah.
It's not simple, but it's easier than restoring the faith of young people in authority. Because many of them, even if they come from conservative Catholic families, have had the respect for authority deconstructed before they even ever reach us. Now, okay, we're not in the age of Reagan and John Paul II, which is what I grew up in, and so you can say, well, we brought it on ourselves. It's a judgment of God. We have the authorities that we deserve in various ways. Civic, ecclesial, all these things. And so, in the current American political climate, added to some of the scandals of church leadership that our young people have come of age, up in the midst of all kinds of questions can arise. But that question of authority, this is Chesterton again. He said that the church has already made all the mistakes. It's very helpful to be a Catholic. All the mistakes have been made. And so we just have to be alert. And how do we find out about that? Well, the tradition, the passing on of the tradition. And so, yes, there are people who ordain themselves to be voices for that tradition. But what's interesting is, and here I'm out over my skis. I think that those things tend to flare out. They really do. Mm-hmm. The proof is in the pudding in that respect, in that oftentimes accounts that seem once or sort of counter bizarro leaders or whatever, who seem invincible, all of a sudden it's gone in a puff of smoke. And that's instructive for those of us who pay attention to it, because we see that the tried and true, that Jesus really was great in setting up the church.
Mhm.
The University of Mary released that small book, The Religion of the Day, and in it there is a small reminder. It's almost a footnote that the majority of us aren't called to fight. But Blaise Pascal said that the most dangerous thing that a man does every day is to read the newspaper. Why? Because to know the news gets you emotively and intellectually and your will engaged. All of the powers of your soul all of a sudden are engaged in problems very far removed from you, over which you have very little influence and almost no responsibility. And so this is what's that Dickens novel of the woman who I think he has a phrase, telescopic philanthropy.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's jibber jabbering about all of these children in Africa, while her own children are falling down the stairs and unclothed and unfed, in this respect. And so I think it's a good reminder to us that we're not meant to live globally. And that there are very few of us in the Catholic Church, precisely one person, entrusted with the whole of the universal church. But there are people in our immediate orbit who need us and whom we neglect to our shame while we're attending to all of these this poofery, which in the end doesn't amount to very much.
That's such wise framing, and especially reading the newspaper now. I mean, think of the degree to that's even exponentially so with social media accounts or following things on X. So let's now turn to the question of authority, because as you started off telling your own narrative about how you ended up in the classroom again during the abuse crisis. So Monsignor, what are some helpful ways you found to frame the reality of the abuse crisis, the consequences that it's had, and how we can move in and through and ultimately beyond that? Because, as you know, many young people will say, why should I take anything you people say seriously because of that? Yeah,
I think so there are many causes to be spoken of. Fundamentally, the devil would be a cause, right. The one who never sleeps and who wants to ruin everything, and so there's that. But I think that this does go right back to what I was talking about: the genesis of the sex abuse scandal and the digestion of it are both profoundly marked by the denial of the fall. The sexual ethics, according to which many were trained in seminaries, and which the ambient culture had picked up in the wake of the sexual revolution, did certainly infect the patterns of mind and the patterns of life of many in the church. And then the ways in which the scandal erupted, and now again, the analog of the scandal of drunkenness as opposed to the sexual abuse of minors, those are different things.
Right.
But going back to Edwin O'Connor's note that one of the great tragedies is to take the part for the whole, and we don't respond Christianly to human fallenness. That's why we simply cancel. We don't have the kind of prudence and realism at the same time about the human condition.
Right.
And so as a result, we've abandoned the categories whereby we can think about this in ways which are both useful, practical, wise, and Christian. And so as a result, sometimes we think about, let's take the abuse scandal and set it to the side and simply think about human sexuality. Oftentimes, it was Frank Sheed, the great apologist, who said most of us don't have Catholic minds. We have worldly minds with little Catholic patches. And I think that very often we digest political and ecclesial scandal according to the categories of the world. And it's utopian thinking. And utopia always and everywhere leads to dystopia. Why? Because it doesn't take into account the fallenness of the human person. And as a result, while I'm hurling vitriol at all of the worthless people out there, I can't stand myself because the amalgam in me of nobility and of brokenness is too much for me to bear. And so oftentimes my response to it is a diversion from myself and the work that the Lord wants me to do internally. Now, this leaves aside all kinds of questions about how best to care for victims, the safeguards which need to be in place, good governance in chanceries and at the Vatican, and all of these kinds of different things. There's much to be said about this, but I'm a college president. And so in terms of assisting young people to recover, I think that's where we started, to recover a sense of trust and authority. Well, I have to do that on my own campus. In other words, I and those in leadership with me need to show and demonstrate to our young people by our example and by the way that we live within the church about what it means to trust authority that's over us and to be good authority to those who are under us. And we do the best we can, not perfectly, but I think we do the best we can.
Sort of filed in the category of some evangelical victories leading to new problems. We can see some parallels here with social media. Is this idea of your life is not about yourself and how?
Do you remember when that came out in the strangest way? It's wonderful.
Oh yeah, it's captivating and it's motivating and it gets you oriented to the right direction. At the same time, there's a perverted version of that, which formally keeps it, your life is not about yourself, but it is about, and usually politics will fill the vacuum there. Or the green movement or, some ideology. So how do we sort of recognize, this is especially the case with young men, recognize the victory of this sort of renewal of a sense of duty, but then orient it back to Christ?
So the new religion, the religion of our culture, the post-Christian, neo-Gnostic, revolutionary, modern religion, that has always within it is this high but ambiguous moral call, which all of these different isms can find their manifestation in. And this is inevitably what happens when you lose the transcendent, when you put not just God in the dock, but put him out to sea. Now that's I'm mixing that. That's terrible. Now I've just confused everybody. Anyway, when you when you put him out to sea, then of course you have to believe in something. And so, and if our responsibility is to build a worldly utopia, both a utopia of my life by watching the right morning routine YouTube videos, right, so that I can make my life a utopia, and then to make a difference in the world and make a utopia, then it's inevitable that I'm going to give myself to these kinds of causes, and they will be political causes, because when faith goes, all that's left is politics. And politics is invigorating within an overall framework. But it's like Newman's circle of knowledge, how you pull out theology and all of the other disciplines rush in to take their place. It's the same. You take out God in the public square, and all of a sudden all kinds of things rush in. But nobody believes in politics enough for it to bear the weight of God and solve the problems of the. I mean, think of our poor leaders today have to do what God used to have to do, which is to bear the whole burden of all suffering and all triumph. You know what I mean? And then it becomes ridiculous. And so, yes, I think that's the case. One time I was in Costa Rica, and I was with my parents, and we went to see a parrot refuge parrot, like these birds, the beautiful birds. And they were all, so we went there because I wanted to see all of these parrots in their native habitat. Well, they weren't in their native habitat. They were like in these nets there were trees, but they weren't in their native habitat. They weren't like flying around free because they were rescue parrots. So they had been permanently, handicapped by contact with human beings. But what was most amazing to me is that the whole place was staffed by young people from Europe who had given 2 to 3 years of their life to come and labor at this parrot rescue refuge. And they were like focused missionaries. It was amazing. I talked to them. They had deep fervor. This was the cause to which they had given themselves in order to rescue the world. They were going to help these parrots, which had been, it was you'd ask them about it, and there would be a gleam in their eyes, and I recognized it because, of course, I've been working with young people all my priesthood, and I was young once. And you have to give. You're right, especially young men. But young people they're high-hearted. They want to give their life to something. They want an adventure. Thank God for the pro-life movement, because we've been able to channel so much of that energy on our campus into love for the unborn. And that's been a very, very helpful thing. And other things too, love for the poor. This is deeply, deeply important. And parrots, they're fine too. they really are. But I mean, 2 to 3 years of one's life, halfway across the world.
Yeah, it's odd.
That's amazing.
Yes. Yes. Well, we wish the parrots well.
Yeah.
You noted how a key part of engaging with young people you found is acknowledging that they have negative feelings, and it's okay for them to have negative feelings. The secular world comes along and says it's okay for you to have negative feelings, and embrace them, make them a part of your identity.
Oh, yeah.
And as a bonus, medicate them at the same time. So how do we, what's the evangelical way of walking that thread where, yes, we recognize the negative feelings, they are real, but they're not a part of who you are?
Yeah, okay. There's a lot of nuance in that question for sure, because very often, does the world say those feelings aren't really negative? Yes, it can often. I think the enemy always apes God, and so oftentimes, live in this angsty, edgy kind of way. But oftentimes they will say the same thing that I was saying, but their meaning is different. They're not actually negative. This is part of who you are. And so embrace who you are and in fact, find the positive in it, these kinds of things. Of course, the difficulty there is most of the time that doesn't track onto adequate anthropology, right. Meaning that if it's true that there's inherent meaning in the world and in every human person, that's a no-go. That's a road that just leads to a great desolation. And so from my perspective, what none of that has is the truth of redemptive suffering, which is one of the great gifts that so I think of Michelle Duong at the end of her life. Right. I mean, she converted her nurses and doctors in her dying, like they joined the Catholic faith. Wow. It's extraordinary. That's the way to die, and so I think that the question of redemptive suffering, oftentimes I'll say to a young person who's in particular anguish over this or that, especially if they're far from home and feeling lonely and there's nothing they can do about what they're suffering about, I'll say, listen, this will hurt you, but it needn't harm you. Yeah. Because we're firmly in the hands of God, nothing can truly harm us. And so you can have courage then. The Italians say this, coraggio, and they say it because it's sometimes more important than intelligence. Coraggio, they say. That we can encourage, in other words, fill with courage the hearts of young people by saying that this is part, you're complicit in the human race. You're a sharer in our joys and in our sorrows. You're entangled in this whole thing, and it's good for you to know this. Mm-hmm. And so how a Christian never asks forever, why am I suffering? At a certain point, you come to the truth of the question, for whom am I suffering? For whom?
Wow.
And this is much better because it fills suffering then with meaning.
Right.
And so I think that that's the way to go, to invite young people into redemptive suffering, because then they don't feel powerless in the midst of it. And to remind them that God is not anxious and wringing his hands and doesn't know what to do. And Jesus Christ is the King, and he still is. He's on the throne. He reigns over heaven and earth, and the hairs on our head are counted. And we're more important than sparrows. And so, yeah, I think that there are other things to be said there, but that's the essence of what I'd say.
Our members found very compelling your statement. The gospel makes things worse at first.
Yeah, sure.
I think we immediately resonate with with what that means.
Yeah.
But of course, a lot of young people, and this certainly includes those who are curious about the faith, go online and they find these great conversion stories where, and perhaps they're more evangelical in nature, meaning of evangelicals, a denomination, that you accept Christ.
Yeah.
You confess with your lips that he is Lord, and everything now is new. Everything is now different. I don't want to discount those stories, but how do you, Monsignor, set the expectations right for what conversion is and what it looks like, especially down the line?
Yeah, well, so again, I feel like I'm overquoting him, but Chesterton said that the Christian ideal hasn't been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried. In other words, the Christian life is not a sudden conversion like that. It wasn't even for St. Paul. St. Paul needed to be healed of blindness, and then he went away for a long time, and then he embarked on his missionary journeys. And so in the old days, this will be fun for some of our listeners. You remember it when computers were just personal computers were kind of out there, and people were using. We would have screensavers to save the screen. I one time walked into the office of some theologians at the Catholic University of America. They were all, I think, 3 professors sharing one computer. That's how old I am. And the screensaver was those words that were bouncing around, and it said, "This screen is being saved." And so, I mean, this is the good Catholic response to, have you been saved? Yes, I'm being saved. You know what I mean? The homo viator, is that how Thomas Aquinas says it? We're men and women on the way. And so it's important that we don't get ahead of ourselves. And so, yeah, I think, here's the thing, and I do say this to young people as well, and I think I'll say it to all of us, because I have to be reminded of it. If you search the New Testament, you never find any evidence of life with God being held out as an achievement. It's always and everywhere spoken of as an endurance, a patient endurance, a perseverance, a steadfastness. And so it's a question of not giving up. And if we don't give up, we always win. That's how God set it up. Because Christ has the final victory over sin and death. So long as we don't give up, we always win. And the enemy knows the ironclad rule, that ironclad rule of the Christian life. He knows that he can't defeat the gospel and the church ultimately by persecution, by inflicting pain upon us, or any of those things. All he can do is get us to give up. And if we don't give up, we always win. And so that perseverance. And so I always tell young people, and it's easy for me to say because my life is now advanced and I have less time to endure this than they do. But I say, you've got to stick with it. You know what I mean? The Lord wants you to stay in communion. And that's what it's all about. And that's the great prize, communion with God, not all of the sort of ethereal pleasure that's attendant upon the emotional experience of conversion, but communion, real life with the one who is God.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many more questions that are have streamed in, and you
Wordsworth, isn't it Wordsworth?
I think it's
Yes,
right.
it's Wordsworth.
What's been bothering you all the time?
Praise God.
It's been processing in the background with the.
The world is too much with us.
Yes,
Late and soon.
yes,
We
that's
have
right.
wasted our powers. Yes.
That's right. So, well, you've addressed the way you framed your answers has addressed many of the discrete questions that have come in.
Yeah.
But one I want to make sure that we address in the just the few moments we still have together is many are so inspired and motivated by what you've given them today and the work of your ministry in general, but they work in secular institutions, including secular institutions of higher learning. So they're asking, and we're all asking, what's a way of framing the exact same message that you've given us in a way that could function within a highly secularized institution?
Well, I think so. So this is a work of great creativity, and oftentimes the way to do it is to say, okay, what's the bad news, and what are the misdiagnoses to the bad news, which postmodernity puts forward, which are this new religion, the neo-Gnostic, utopian, revolutionary, progressive religion puts forward. So there's a misdiagnosis over here. And I think that one of the things that Christians in the secular world can do is begin to chip away at the assumptions that people bring to the problems in their life and all around them.
That's great.
Because people are struggling, they're suffering, people are profoundly unhappy in the world. And so if you look around, you don't have to look very far to find someone with whom you can share your faith. And oftentimes that begins by sharing life. And in sharing life, oftentimes it begins by sharing sorrows, heartbreak, difficulty, and then beginning to provide for them a more adequate diagnostic than what they've been given, because most people have misdiagnosed themselves. ChatGPT can't tell you what's really wrong. Right. Mihi quaestio factus sum. I became a great problem to myself, Augustine said, and that's how people feel. And then, of course, looking then for opportunities to share the good news too, which is really important. My friend Monsignor Tom Richter wrote a little pamphlet called "Evangelization Without Complication," and I think one of his central theses in that is that we overcomplicate evangelization. That we think that in order to share the gospel, we need to go away to a seminar or watch a bunch of these. You should, in fact, be as engaged in the Word on Fire Institute as possible. But that we have to be, that there's some special training, or that you need an MA in theology in order to evangelize. Well, no, that can't be true, because you can't be a believer without evangelizing. Like your faith grows insofar as you share it. Right. It's one of the, and so if you're like an anonymous Christian, whatever that is, if that's what you're up to, that's not going to work out well. You know what I mean? You have to share your faith. But oftentimes we overcomplicate it. We have to think, okay, what am I good at? What do I like doing? What do I enjoy? What gives me life? And how can I share it with other people in my life? And how can I do it as a believer? And that kind of thing is, if we were to go out tonight to a new restaurant that's never, that just opened this week, and it's mind-blowingly good, are we going to come back and say, we'd love to tell people about that, but we don't know how? Like, maybe I need a seminar. Maybe I should sign up.
A great example.
Maybe I need a master's degree on restaurant reviews. No, you just say, this place is amazing, and I had the tater tots or whatever. What else from the Midwest? Tater tots, Jello. I had the Jello was good. the rice. This is Minnesota.
Hot dish.
Right?
Hot dish. Yeah.
Anyway, we overcomplicate it. But I think that we do hold a little kit in the kerygma. We've got the right diagnoses. Whatever the problem is, in anyone's life, we know the root cause. And how much do we have to have low regard for the people in our life not to help them if we ourselves have found it?
Monsignor Shea, on behalf of the Institute family, thank you.
It's been a joy, Matt. It's been a great joy to be here. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody.
And thank you, all of us, for joining us. Please remember that we've just recorded this entire presentation and conversation, and we'll have it available for you very soon on the Word on Fire Institute platform. Thanks again, friends. Again, it's because of you that all this is possible. We'll see you again soon, and God bless.